Can you
Yes,
see
we
it?
can see. Yes.
Great. So I'm going to, yeah, this is kind of a whistle-stop tour, if you like, of the research that I've been involved with now for um, just over 20 years, actually, which is a bit scary. And because it's that kind of length of time, I just want to obviously credit the people that I've worked with. We very rarely work on our own, do we? So I always like to just acknowledge that these people have been really instrumental in shaping and making sense of the work that we've done together. So I'll talk to you about how we started really and thinking about domestic and sexual violence, I suppose, in 2004 is when we started. And we started from a kind of feminist and intersectional place. So I think what feminism has given us when we're talking about interpersonal violence is the understanding that this is about power, the abuse of power, and of one partner exerting power and control over another, rather than in the criminal justice kind of lens, seeing individual incidents. That feminist analysis encourages us to see not individual or separate or discrete incidents, but to see patterns of behaviour that over time result in one partner exerting power and control over the other. And when we started this work, myself and Marianne Hester, we were trying to think about what we could focus on. And it struck us that actually in domestic, when you're talking about domestic abuse, people enter those relationships freely with consent and with also the hope that this is going to be a positive experience, that there's going to be love, that there's going to be desire, attraction, care, and that maybe this might be a relationship that might last, that may even be forever. So we wanted to look at love and violence and the implications of love and discourses of love and practices of love in domestically abusive relationships. So that's what we started out with. Over time, I've been interested in why don't LGBT people recognize domestic abuse? Why don't they call it domestic abuse? Um, why don't practitioners recognize LGBT domestic abuse? And we have so many accounts of people being let down by practitioners when they do come forward. And I have to say that in the main, LGBT people don't use mainstream domestic abuse services, whether they're statutory or in the voluntary sector. There's a great report came out a couple of years ago by Gallup. They commissioned a report on LGBT victim survivors of domestic abuse and where they sought help, and it's really eye-opening that most people don't seek help. And when they do, they don't necessarily get a very good response from the existing services unless they live within the remit of or specialist LGBT domestic abuse services, which I'll talk briefly about later as well. So, oop, I can't use that. I have to use this. So some of the answers to those questions that I posed there was we argue that there's a public story of domestic abuse. So we were using the idea of public stories that Lynn Jameson offers us to think about how our everyday lives are kind of given shape and meaning by public stories that exist in society culturally, and they kind of give us guidance or ideas about what our lives might consist of, and that this public story of domestic abuse is really the outcome of successful feminist activism, scholarship, and lobbying to transform our understanding of domestic abuse from it being seen as an individual problem to being seen as a social problem, a very serious social problem that everybody should be concerned with. And the recent violence, ending violence and abuse strategy from the government has a whole section on the need for a whole society approach. But the problem with the public story of domestic abuse is that it has constructed this idea that the problem is cisgender heterosexual men, 4 cisgender heterosexual women, and that the problem is primarily of physical violence, and that it's a particular presentation of genders. So big, strong men being physically violent towards small, weak women. And that's a really powerful story. And if you Google images of domestic abuse, you often get those kind of imagery of women are always smaller on the floor or crouching, and men are always looming over them, always bigger, always with a fist clenched. My later work with Rebecca Barnes, we kind of developed this idea of the public story to focus in on the binaries that are the result of that public story. So there's the public story challenges us because it's hard to believe or imagine that women can be perpetrators of domestic abuse, and that conversely, men can be victims. So these binaries overlay each other: woman, man, victim, survivor, perpetrator, weak, strong, passive, agentic, femininity and masculinity. And those overlapping binaries make it quite difficult for people who are in same-sex relationships to tell their stories of domestic abuse, and for others to hear them, for practitioners to hear them, because they don't fit the public story. So if you have 2 men or 2 women in a relationship, then the assumption is that somehow it's a fair fight. So there are assumptions about femininity, that women are not aggressive. And so if women are violent towards each other, they're not going to cause the same kind of harm that a man can cause towards a woman. And similarly, because men are naturally aggressive or competitive, that they are able to be aggressive towards each other, but also that they can defend themselves. So again, it's not as risky as when heterosexual women are victimized by men. So if you have those assumptions that are percolating, then we can see that men and women in same-sex relationships might find it hard to imagine themselves as being victims in that public story of domestic abuse. And in the literature, there's quite a lot of assumptions made that what characterizes LGBT domestic abuse is mutual abuse, or sometimes it's called bidirectional violence. And I really believe that that's because people find it hard to understand how you identify the perpetrator and the victim when there's 2 women or 2 men in front of you. And of course, with people who are non-binary or genderqueer, then that's even more challenging to understand that public story and how that operates in those relationships when there are gender non-conforming people who are intimate partners. So we wanted to try and think about how we could still think about how power operates, but get away from a kind of heteronormative, a cisgender heteronormative understanding of power. And we were thinking about how in relationship, the kind of relationship models that exist for us in society, again, a set of public stories that might exist or scripts that might exist, that you have an initiator and a responder. The person who does all the work, asking people out for the date, initiating sex, asking if you can move in together, asking if you can get married, setting the terms for the relationship, making the key decisions, and then the responder who literally responds to those initiations. So hoping to be asked out, waiting to be called or messaged, responding to the initiation of sex, accepting a marriage proposal or an offer to live together, accommodating to the relationship terms. And of course, that you can see how this can be laid over with a kind of heteronormative, cis heteronormative romantic model, but it doesn't have to be embodied by women and men in a cis heteronormative way. That model of a binaried way of approaching intimacy is out there for all of us. LGBT people live in the same society as heterosexual cisgender people, and we are influenced by the same kinds of public stories about what intimacy might look like. So when we were looking at abusive relationships, it became very clear that we could talk about power and control in terms of two relationship rules in a domestically abusive relationship. So the work that we did, the first research that we did, compared love and violence in heterosexual and same-sex relationships, as we called it then. So we were also interviewing heterosexual women and a very small number of heterosexual men as well. So these kinds of ideas applied to their relationships as well as to the LGBT people who were involved in the study. So the relationship rules, there are two. One is that the relationship is for the abusive partner. It's on their terms and they make all the key decisions. Key decisions can shift and change across relationships. They can shift and change within a relationship. The important thing is that the abusive partner makes the rules and expects conformity to them and is willing to use abusive behaviours to elicit conformity and obedience to the rules. The second rule is that the victim survivor is responsible for everything. So they're responsible for the relationship, they're responsible for the abuse, they're responsible for the abusive partner, they're responsible for children if they have them, and they're responsible for the home if they share one. Of course, they don't have to have children or share a home in order to be in a domestically abusive relationship. And then what's love got to do with it? So love can be a very powerful glue in domestically abusive relationships. So again, Lynn Jameson's work and other people's work, Duncan and Marsden did work on heterosexual couples and talking about how do people understand romantic relationships, intimate relationships. And one of the things is that people see the relationship as a joint project. So two people coming together and having a joint project where each has their needs met, ideally. In an abusive relationship, it's not a joint project because the relationship rule number one has to be met, which is that the relationship is for the abusive partner. The victim survivor might believe that it is a joint project, but learns very quickly that the relationship is for the abusive partner. Abusive partners also declare love, make declarations of love or practices of love in critical moments. So if a victim survivor is threatening to leave, looks like they might leave, looks like they've been pushed to the limit, abusive partners might buy presents, might bring flowers, might swear that they'll change, might ask for help to change their behavior, might say that they can't live without them, might say that they'll kill themselves if the victim survivor leaves them. And that kind of glue of love and practices of love is very powerful. In the England and Wales Crime Survey a few years ago, they asked people why they didn't leave. And love was in the top 3 reasons why people didn't leave what they call in the England and Wales Crime Survey partner abuse. So it's a very powerful emotion, and it doesn't just mean that people don't leave, it also means that they might leave, but then they come back. So they return because they love the abusive partner. They want to believe that they can change. They don't want to necessarily criminalize the partner. They just want the abuse to stop. So the other aspect that we looked at or that we could see evidence of is what we call disclosing intimacy. So again, Jameson talks about this, about how in intimate partners relationships, they tell each other things, and they tell each other things that they might not tell other people. So things that they might feel slightly ashamed of, things that they might feel that are quite precious to them, desires, wishes, ambitions, things like, I remember interviewing a heterosexual woman who told her partner that she wanted to go back to school. And of course, that meant that she wasn't allowed outside the house for quite some time, as a response to her revealing that that was something that she wanted to do. So when victim survivors do disclose share things about themselves to abusive partners, they use that because abusive partners will use anything that works to control and or punish a partner. And but abusive partners also disclose, because when we spoke to people who had been victimized, they could tell us why the abusive partner had behaved the way that they did. So abusive partners will disclose that they've had terrible childhoods, that they've got substance misuse problems, that nobody has ever understood them, that their employer bullies them, that their parents were awful to them. They can explain why, and they feel sorry for their abusive partner, especially when they are committing to changing their behaviour and asking for help. And often, very often, victim survivors can want to protect the abusive partner and help them to change. Of course, this very, very rarely actually happens in real life, but that is the intention of practices of love and the abusive partner's way of keeping the victim survivor hooked into the relationship. So we changed, I mean, I don't know, you might be aware of the Duluth Power and Control Wheel, which is very often used in the domestic abuse field. It's called the Duluth Power and Control Wheel because it was developed in Duluth in America. And we changed it because we wanted to put relationship rules at the center so that it would take away the public story, so that we wouldn't be thinking about men and women, we would just be thinking about abusive power relationships. Put power and control around that, then all of the kinds of tactics that can be used, emotional abuse. My vision, what I can see is not very clear. I hope that it is clear, that you can read each of those spokes in the wheel. You can, that's good. I can't see them properly. And then around that, the practices of love, and around that, people's intersecting identities, because it's absolutely key to understanding that people's identities shape and form how they make sense of what is happening to them, whether they decide that it's enough to seek help, who they decide to seek help from, and what kind of options they might believe are available to them. So, for example, if they are people of faith and they're married, divorce might not ever be an option. So understanding where people are coming from through their intersecting identities is really important to making sense of how they are making sense of what's happening and what they think can change. Oops, sorry, I've clicked too quickly there. So the other thing about LGBT people is help seeking and help providing, and the perennial concerns related to this. So how the problem is defined. And I've spoken about that in terms of the prevalence of the public story of domestic abuse, prevalence, privatization of help seeking, which is what I think happens for LGBT people, and the availability of services. Now, the statutory definition in the Domestic Abuse Act has two parts to it. So it talks about relationship contexts, and it talks about the range of behaviours that make up domestic abuse. So relationship contexts for domestic abuse has to be a personal connection. So that includes family relationships. It includes current and ex-intimate partner relationships, and it is a gender and sexuality neutral definition. People have to be over the age of 16, and it doesn't matter whether they're sharing a home or not. So it's important to remember that the domestic abuse includes family abuse, and that's really important for LGBT people. And when we look at prevalence, so the most robust survey that we've got that gives us information about partner abuse, sexual violence, stalking is the England and Wales Crime Survey. And in 2018, they did they kind of focused in on the participants who had identified as lesbian or bisexual. They didn't do it looking at gay men or bisexual men, and there isn't an opportunity to record whether you identify as transgender. So that's what we're left with. But when they asked about partner abuse, bisexual women were, lesbians and bisexual women are proportionately more likely to report partner abuse than heterosexual women. And bisexual women are 5 times more likely to report sexual abuse. Now, what it doesn't tell us is the gender identity or the sexuality of their partner. So it could well be that many of those partners are men or ex-partners, but it does tell us that there is something quite serious going on in the relationships of lesbians and bisexual women. Yet, in international, national, or local policy, LGBT is an add-on rather than an embedded. And the agenda is always described as the violence against women and girls agenda rather than a gender-based violence agenda. And we can see that in the recent ending violence and abuse strategy from the government that has as the headline, subtitle, violence against women and girls. LGBT, I think, is mentioned once in that strategy, which, in the strategy, which is about 90 pages long. So it feels very much like an add-on. And when you're looking at how LGBT people seek help, they are rarely using mainstream or violence against women and girls domestic abuse organisations. They're rarely using the police. They typically use counsellors, therapists, mental health services. So that's why I'm talking about the privatisation of the problem. So it seems to me that that same transformation that feminists have been able to secure for heterosexual domestic abuse has not happened for LGBT domestic abuse. It is still understood as an individual problem rather than a social problem. And very often people don't want to, if they even recognise that what's happening to them as domestic abuse, they're wary of reporting it, partly because they don't want to have discrimination or prejudice from help providers, either for themselves or for their abusive partner. And very similar reasons as well. Those who do come forward, they fear that they're not going to be taken seriously, or they don't want to get their partner into trouble. But with LGBT people as well, they often talk about not wanting to damage the reputation of LGBT people more generally. So they kind of carry a burden of feeling that they shouldn't let the side down by coming forward to say that their relationship has been abusive, when that might feed into homo, bi, or transphobic ideas about LGBT people's abilities to have violence-free relationships. And this is it's already out of date. We did it in 2021 for the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office, a mapping study. And on the left is the map of where LGBT by and for domestic abuse services are in England and Wales. So none in Wales, none in the northeast and Cumbria. Birmingham, Manchester, London, I think even Rise in Brighton no longer has it. So cluster of ones around London. Gallup also provides the national helpline for LGBT domestic abuse, and they've recently developed a caseworker service which they can provide to people wherever they live. So that's a really huge improvement. Given the coverage. The map on the right is slightly better. So that's services that are mainstream, but they provide, they advertise that they provide an LGBT specialism, either in the form of a member of staff who's become a champion for LGBT domestic abuse, or they might have a trained LGBT IDFA. But as you can see, again, it's very sparse. And as I say, it's already out of date because things close or new things open. There's a new one down in the southwest that we didn't pick up on in that survey. So that's important to keep in mind, that these are snapshots rather than necessarily the truth now. So I did a brief, very brief, kind of informed estimate of how many LGBT people in Nottingham might be victim survivors of domestic abuse. So I'm sure you can correct me if I've got these figures wrong. I just looked this morning. Population of Nottingham, 331,000. The estimate from the census of LGB and other sexualities. So again, I couldn't find the figure for Nottingham in terms of trans people or genderqueer or gender non-conforming people. So this again only looks at LGB and other sexuality population, is 4.89%. So that comes to about 16,000 LGBT people in Nottingham. And then I'm just looking at, so if we did the estimate of domestic abuse prevalence in heterosexual women from the Office for National Statistics analysis of the England and Wales Crime Survey, then that's 971 people. If we took the percentage of 10.9, which it was for bisexual women, then we're looking at 1,763 people. And if we're looking at 8%, which it was for lesbians, then we're looking at 1,295 people in Nottingham who might have experienced domestic abuse in the previous 12 months. So, and I'm kind of thinking, where are they? Where might they be and where are they going? Because as I say, they're not really appearing in the police. They're not, where they're going is counselling and therapy, and we don't know what kind of service they're getting there. And we don't think that they're arriving in local domestic abuse services, certainly not in the numbers that are there. So the literature talks about, in the main, that there are many more similarities than differences between domestic abuse in the relationships of LGBT people and heterosexual people. Abusive people use sexual violence, emotional violence, financial violence, psychological violence, physical violence, and of course coercive control. So these are the same across all abusive relationships, that these are features of them. And of course abusive partners use, as I said before, whatever works in terms of how they might control, undermine, threaten and punish a victim survivor. The two things that we found that all victim survivors had in common was isolation and being undermined in terms of their sense of self. People writing about LGBT domestic abuse often focus on the differences in terms of identity abuse and kind of say that's what defines LGBT domestic abuse. So identity abuse can be threatening to out somebody, mocking or undermining somebody's sense of being authentically gay or a woman or bisexual, and then sexual abuse predicated on stereotypes about gay, lesbian, and bisexuality, and or fetishizing trans and non-binary bodies. So identity abuse can be very real, but I would argue that that is very similar for heterosexual women, that they also experience identity abuse. But of course, in a different way, targeting their identities of gender and sexuality and any other identities that they have. So for LGBT identity abuse, it might be that it's about presentation of self, clothes, use of makeup, liking particular kinds of music or art, use of hormones, medications or adaptations, their hairstyle, their jewelry, their body decoration, their choice of media or culture, their being out or not. Also in terms of their priorities or roles and what they're expected to do around a shared home or in relation to children, how they're expected to perform or respond in relation to sex, how they're expected to respond or perform in relation to other people. Jealousy is a really powerful motivator for abuse and culturally is seen as quite acceptable. And then social connectedness, whether they socialize, who they socialize with, whether or they might be employed, to what extent are they independent, to what extent do they have autonomy. But I think if you looked at those, you could see very similar things happening for heterosexual cisgender women as well. Identity abuse, I think, also underpins family abuse. And family abuse has most often been associated with so-called honor-based violence and has been incorrectly associated with particular racially minoritized communities and or communities of faith. But that means that the family abuse that white secular LGBT people experience from their families of origin, they fall through the cracks. And as well as those LGBT people who do come from racially minoritized communities or communities of faith. And identity abuse underpins that family abuse, beliefs that children are the possession of their families, that children should obey, adult children should obey their parents or elders, that girls, boys, women, and men should conform to norms of gender and sexuality in their presentation of self, in their identities, in their practices, and that parents, elders, or faith leaders have the right to regulate, enforce conformity, and also to act to save an adult child who might be, in their terms, endangering their soul. And conversion practices can be seen as an example of identity abuse and family abuse. We also found evidence of what we called experiential power. So where it might be that the abusive partner is older, but it doesn't have to be related to age. It's more likely to be, it's more often related to how much longer they've been out, how much experience they have of being out, having LGBT relationships, being part of the scene, understanding LGBT culture. And that can be used to exert power and control over victim survivors who are less knowledgeable, new, might be their first relationship as a LGBT person, and older, more experienced abusive partners can manipulate them, make them believe that how they want the relationship to run is normal, and their expectations of what it is to be gay or lesbian or bisexual are normal, and that the victim survivor should expect to conform to those rules. So the conclusions that we've come to is that we need to start talking about domestic abuse in LGBT communities, that this is a significant problem in those communities. We need to learn about domestic abuse more generally so that we can identify it and talk about it and understand what help is available. Challenge those who say it doesn't happen, encourage people to come forward and report, encourage campaigns to be inclusive. So violence against women and girls strategically makes sense in terms of the wider social structural context, the patriarchal context that creates the conditions in which domestic abuse can take place. But if we're trying to provide and make sure that every victim survivor who needs it can get help, then we need to think differently about how we talk about the problem so that people who don't see themselves in the public story of domestic abuse can also be validated in their experience and feel safe coming forward. So that's me. Thank you very much. Any thoughts, questions, friendly criticism, even gratefully received. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Catherine. I will stop recording now. Thank you for